classmates, colleagues, and friends, please welcome, to continue the proud tradition of the Orion Scott Lecture Series, Brite's Assistant Professor of New Testament, the Reverend Dr. Jeremy Williams.
Well, good morning, everyone. First, let me clearly say that I did not pay Kyle to read that or to say that, and I don't. I'm gonna have to take him around with me everywhere I go because it was really powerful. Thank you so much. Also, I'm grateful to see the president, dean, faculty, colleagues here, as well as students. Other administrative staff. So good that all of us are here. If I was in church, I would say, as James said to John, and John said to Peter, and Peter said to Jesus, it is good for us to be here. Yeah, okay, y'all gonna talk back. All right. I had to do a different kind of lecture in here. But I'm so grateful to be here with you today. You got up early this morning to prepare yourselves and be here, and I hope that it is worth your time. In terms of the bio, one aspect that he mentioned that might seem strange is that I might look a little too young to have been in ministry for over 20 years, but there's someone in the audience who can vouch for most of those years. She's a Brite alum, and she's been an encourager and supporter of me from the beginning, and that's right here on the front row, Reverend Dolly Pankey. Let's give God some praise for her. She joined us from her current home and my home state of Alabama to be here at Ministers Week. Thank you for being here. Now, one last piece of prologue. If there are any issues with my lecture today, please know that I wrote a good portion of it with only one hand while I was doing the best I could to entertain our little 5-month-old. So now to our work for today. Now, I did have a PowerPoint prepared, but I think there might be some technical challenges. So in some ways, you'll have to use some of the ancient Greek ekphrasis. Hopefully, I can paint the word picture with my words, and you can see it in your mind. So listen closely, please, and I apologize for that. This Ministers Week invites us to imagine the future church. For me, it is important to take a bit of a Sankofa approach, for we can only truly imagine our way forward by looking back. Looking back toward an early account of the first people to be a part of the Jesus movement and how Acts portrays them. Acts portrays them as literally getting in the way. And for those who may not remember, the name of this lecture is a church. It's in the way. The way is Acts' preference for describing the first group of Jesus followers. The Greek term heihodos can mean way or road, and it can mean this quite literally. In Greece, hodos is the name for streets, to the point that where exits are labeled Exodus, the same name of the second book of and there we are. Let's give it up for the media person in the back. Thank you, sir. There you can see Exodus. Oh, I can see it. You can't see it. You have to walk by faith and not by sight. The term way, it also reflects the onward progression of the narrative and the theme of movement that is dominant in both Luke and Acts of the Apostles. It captures a shared journey or a path to a destination. In line with this travel motif of a collective, my favorite way to translate this word in Acts of the Apostles is movement. This understanding and use of it, of the way it is in Acts, is fundamental to how I want us to think about a church that gets in the way. I prefer way or movement over Christian. First, because Acts prefers it. Second, even when Acts does use the term Christian, It is not a name that the Jesus followers call themselves. Third, Christian does not mean in Acts what it comes to mean, especially after the conversion of Constantine in the 4th century. And fourth, Christian covers up the movement aspects of the group described in Acts. So I thus prefer Messiah movement. And thinking about the church as such will help us to look at 3 aspects of the way or movement that I intend to discuss in our time together. So if you're taking notes, these are the major movements so that you can see how I'm going to be moving through this lecture. The first 2 aspects that I want us to consider for how a church gets in the way, the first is that it continues the movement in the way of Jesus, the just one, who was executed by the Romans, and who Acts contends that God raised from the dead. The second movement of this lecture is connected to the first. This aspect invites us to consider a church that extends the movement of Jesus by getting in the way of institutional, interpersonal, and internal injustices, harms, and evil. It also invites us to consider with whom in ancient and modern times the church or movement should demonstrate solidarity. While discussing this second aspect, I'll incorporate the third to discuss how the church gets in its own way to become the fullest embodiment of the Jesus movement, a movement of liberation, healing, and justice. It gets in its own way by participating in the very injustices that it was founded to critique. Acts first uses the term heihodos, or the way or the movement, as a name for Jesus followers in Acts chapter 9. There, Paul requests a warrant from the high priest's office to round up, arrest, and charge those who were participants in the way or the movement. And it's on the way to the way that he meets the way, on the Damascus way. So y'all caught what I did there. Y'all are indulging my black preacher homiletical sensibilities. He's traveling to the way, and he gets stopped by Jesus, who John says is the way. Now, I do want to note that Luke and John have different portraits of Jesus, but in this regard, both draw a connection between the idea of the way, traveling, a journey, with participating in communities that claim to follow Jesus. So if you indulge me again, Paul went on the way to search out the way and met the way on the way. And Jesus asks a simple question. The Greek, ti me diokes, why do you prosecute me? Note here, I've translated the Greek word dioko as prosecute rather than persecute. I translate the word as such, as prosecute rather than persecute, to highlight how it presents the way or the movement as a target of official legal systems. They're not merely the victims of zealous religious bigotry, but they are the victims of state-sponsored, imperially powered, corrupted court, systemic legal attacks. Jesus epitomizes this victimization as the one whom the centurion at the foot of the cross recognizes as the just one, which is an acknowledgement of the fact that Jesus is indeed the just one, although he was executed by the collusion of the Jerusalem court system and Roman imperial power. Jesus was prosecuted as a criminal. And thinking of Jesus and the way or movement as prosecuted rather than persecuted leads us to recognize that our romanticization of these stories lifts them as martyrs for a cause rather than as victims of a system. Now, on the PowerPoint, I had a really interesting presentation from one of my students' final projects who actually created an art museum exhibit. Maybe if you're able, can you turn to the back? Because I really thought this was really powerful. One of my students gave this powerful demonstration in a final project, and some of which I'd like to share with you now. The student is Annie Wilder, and she gave me permission to share this. She created an art exhibit inspired by Raoul Peck's documentary, I Am Not Your Negro, which was based on American literary giant James Baldwin's unfinished manuscript, Remember This House. Her exhibit that mirrored a museum display was entitled, Jesus is Not Your Martyr. This slide and ones like it help you to imagine yourself in the space and the size of the exhibits. Her exhibit helps us to consider what it means for Jesus the Just One to be treated as a criminal and criminalized by Roman state officers. This leads to a distinction between prosecution and persecution highlighted here. A simple translation difference, which is in the semantic range of the Greek word dioko, can impact how we think of Jesus and his way. It can impact how we understand who Jesus aligns with. As you see here, she placed the traditional icon of Jesus next to George Floyd, who the Speaker of the House at the time, Nancy Pelosi, thanked for sacrificing his life after he was under a police officer's knee for 8 minutes and 43 seconds. Reading Jesus in this way helps us to do what James Cone suggests and see Jesus in all of the crucified people of the world. As you can see, in the name Jesus here, there are names of victims of state violence, extrajudicial prosecution. And this class was in 2021, so to this list of names, we can now add the name of Tyree Nichols in Memphis. The way of Jesus, from this perspective, is led by one who was unjustly prosecuted, but who was ultimately the just one. And the evidence for Acts that Jesus was the just one is that God raised him from the dead. And you can turn around now. Yeah, I didn't want you to get a crook in your neck, as we would say in Alabama. To this fact, Jesus' followers, especially those eyewitness apostles, are to serve as legal witnesses, which is the Greek word martus, which provides the foundation for which we get the idea of being a martyr. The apostles are to be witnesses to his execution of the execution of innocent people. And they had to be a witness to how a marginalized, justice-seeking, anointed healer and teacher from a little town in Galilee got caught up and on the wrong side of Jerusalem power for speaking truth to that power. One who Acts has to describe himself in Luke 4 as aligning with the prophet Isaiah and declaring that the Spirit of God is upon me because God has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. God has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set those who are oppressed free, to proclaim the year of God's favor, even at the end of that liberative message in his home. People wanted him dead. Now, Jesus' execution differs from Stephen's death, which occurs extrajudicially as the people take Stephen outside the city to stone him after his witness to the Jerusalem court. Jesus is executed under the law, and it can be viewed as extrajudicial only to the extent that low-status people or peregrini were often not even considered worthy of the law and were even considered outside of the law. And although Jesus is not considered worthy of the law, Acts sees that Jesus is indeed the just one. But the law and those representing it, including Roman appointed officials, and the Roman-appointed high priest-led Jerusalem court and temple police epitomize the need for humans to repent, or to think differently at a system-wide level and in a universal manner. In Acts, Peter and Stephen are the first bold examples of witnessing to this truth. Both are physically injured for attempting to set the record straight before the high priest and that court. Then in Acts 9, Paul goes to that court to get arrest warrants for those part of this way in Damascus to bring them back to Jerusalem. Which brings us back to the passage we were discussing before. While on this mission, Paul, called Saul at the time, gets asked by the resurrected Jesus, "Why are you prosecuting me?" Almost as if to say, why are you leveraging legal systems and relative power to attack a minoritized group? Don't you know it's hard to kick against the goads? This line is similar to a line in Euripides' Bacchae, where the god Dionysus speaks to King Pentheus, who resists the Bacchic movement. Dionysus tells Pentheus that his legal authority cannot overwhelm divinity, regardless of if he has the human power to criminalize or not. Similarly, Paul's character cannot resist Jesus, although he has the authority to criminalize him via his people, which is another theme from Euripides' Bacchae, that by attacking the followers, you attack the leader. By the time Paul recounts this narrative in Acts 22, he's no longer prosecuting Jesus, but he also understands Jesus to be the just one. And in Acts 23, Paul speaks of himself as a part of the way or the movement. So now that we've given a brief sketch about how the way or the movement focuses on Jesus, the Messiah who was the just one, and how Acts works to portray individuals who got in the way, that is, became a part of the movement, now we can turn to examine how the movement got into the way of other types of injustice. In Acts 16, the movement or way gets in the way in Philippi. Literally, these are the words that an enslaved girl declares about Paul and Silas and other members of the movement. She says, "These men are slaves of the Most High God, the highest God, and they show a movement or way or heihodos of salvation, healing, rescue." Let's look at the entire passage. Since this is a lecture from a Bible scholar, y'all don't mind if I read the Bible to you, do you? It's a bunch of verses. I was going to popcorn it around and let people help me to read, but indulge me. Acts 16:16. "And it was as we were going to the place of prayer, a certain enslaved girl who had a Pythian spirit met us. She supplied her masters, enslavers, much productive labor through the work of her divination. Trailing behind Paul and us, she cried out, saying, 'These people are slaves of the highest God. These proclaim to you a movement of salvation.' She did this for many days. Paul was grieved, and he turned to the spirit and said, 'I summon you in the name of Messiah Jesus to come out of her.' And it came out of her that hour. When her enslavers saw that their hope of labor came to an end, they took hold of Paul and Silas and dragged them into the market square to the authorities. And when they brought them forward, the sheriffs said this to the sheriffs, 'These people are stirring up our city. They are Jews, and they proclaim customs which are not lawful for us as Romans to accept or do.' The crowd joined in attacking them, and the sheriffs commanded them to be beaten after stripping their clothes. After roughing them up, they threw them into jail and commanded the prison guard to hold them securely. Per instruction, he threw them into the innermost jail and secured their feet in wooden stocks." If I was in church, I'd say, "But at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and celebrating God, and the imprisoned ones were listening to them. Suddenly there was a great shaking, to the point that the foundation of the prison shook. All the gates were opened on the spot, and the imprisonment of all was loosened. The prison guard became woke. That's the Greek, Gregoritai. And seeing the open doors of the jail, drew the sword and prepared to use it on himself because he thought that the prisoners had run away. Then Paul shouted with a great voice, saying, "Do not harm yourself. We are all here." Asking for a light, he busted in trembling and fell before Paul and Silas. Then upon leading them out, he said, "Gentlemen, what is necessary for me to be rescued?" They said, "Put your trust in Master Jesus, and you and your whole house will be rescued." They shared the story of the Lord with all in his household. He took them even at that hour of night and cleaned their wounds. Then he and all of the folks were baptized. He then led them to his home where a table had been set, and the whole house, having trusted in God, rejoiced. The next day, the sheriff sent the armed deputy, saying, "Free those people." The prison guard announced the message to Paul. "The sheriffs have sent the message you should be freed. So as you go, leave in peace." But Paul responded to them in front of everybody, "They flayed us, Roman people, though we were not condemned. They threw us into jail. Now they kick us out secretly. Hell no." That's ugar. That's the Greek. And if you can't tell, this is my translation. It's a fresh translation for you. "Let them come out and lead us out." The armed deputies reported these words to the sheriffs. When the sheriffs heard that they were Romans, they got scared. They came and consoled Paul and Silas while leading them out. They begged them to leave the city. And upon leaving the jail, they went to Lydia's house and consoled the siblings and left. Acts 16 through 40. To carefully examine these words, especially those words from the enslaved girls with the Pythian spirit, that these people, these men, are slaves of the highest God, and they proclaim a movement of salvation, liberation, healing. I want to invite us to use a method that I teach my students, some are here, called the box method. And we use it to explain how a text is like a box. It has to be examined from multiple angles in order for us to be deliberate about our interpretive choices. Louis Althusser writes that there is no such thing as an innocent reading. We must say what readings we are guilty of. So I'll give a truncated presentation of this, what is normally itself a 50-minute, 75-minute presentation for the box method. So the first aspect that we look at is in front of the text or in front of the box. And what's in front of the box is the reader. The reader's context is important. And in many ways, it is almost as important as the ancient text itself, because it provides the initial filter whereby we engage the passage. This takes into account race, gender, class, sexual orientation, ability, citizenship status, and other markers that are constitutive of the reader. And for us, in a large way, we share some contextual pieces. For example, we're all here at the Ministers' Week in a lecture on Acts of the Apostles entitled "The Church That Gets in the Way." So in some ways, this has shaped what our expectations for the text are. And even still, there are so many differences that we bring in front of the box. Then we move to what I call behind the box. You know, next time I know just to bring a box, just in case the PowerPoint doesn't work. So in front of the box, you're in front of the box. And then we move to what I call behind the box, which asks the question, how does the text mean? How does the text mean? For whom and with what effects? I borrowed these questions from one of my teachers at Harvard, Karen King. These questions force us to name our approach, because in the same way our context controls our interpretation, so does our approach impact our interpretation. What questions do we bring to the text? And who has asked the type of questions that we bring to the text? And the questions that I bring to the text for us today are: what can we learn about ancient enslavement, incarceration, and inequity? What ways does the movement in Acts function as a model for contemporary people? In what ways is the movement not successful and should not be followed? Where should Acts' worldview be critiqued? And how can Acts lead us critically to engage our world? Now, some approaches that ask the questions around enslavement and inequity are liberation theology, feminist rhetorical criticism, womanist cultural criticism, post-colonial criticism, and minoritized criticisms. Now, these approaches engage the text with a hermeneutic of suspicion, to keep a careful eye on the kyriarchy, or the rule of the master. A helpful approach for these issues, especially the issue of incarceration, or for incarceration, is critical criminology studies, or carceral studies, or abolitionist approaches, and minoritized criticisms, which raise the question: what do prisons tell us about the societies that make them? Bringing these types of approaches to Acts helps us to move from what I call behind the box to beside the box, or the context. And from beside the box, we examine the context of the passage and who composed the first audiences, so that we can reconstruct their reception or resistance to the text that we have in front of us. Which finally leads us to in the box. What are the options that the words can mean together? And what are the stories that they can tell? The words for our examination, again, are: these people are slaves of the highest God. These proclaim to you a movement of salvation. Now, before I go further, I want to quickly remind us of the three moves of this lecture. The first is to demonstrate how Acts uses the way, or the movement. The second wants to demonstrate how the movement got in the way of injustices like inequity, enslavement, and incarceration. And I would like to tackle the second move with the third move, which is how the church gets in its own way from stopping injustice, from having abolitionist visions, and from imagining itself as a tool for creating the world that can be, a world that has just not yet become. So I'll be doing a bit of a ping pong game. I really like this graphic that I had here, just so you can see it. So I'm doing a bit of a ping pong. Some of y'all remember that game. And so it's a bit of a ping pong between in the way of injustice and the church getting in its own way. Now, it's customary to look at this Acts passage and view Paul and his team as heroes. And if we take a liberationist approach, we can see that indeed Paul exercises the Pythian spirit of the enslaved girl. This action directly impacts the pockets of the slave owners who had used this girl prophet to turn a profit for them. But a feminist rhetorical critical approach, like the one put forth by my colleague Shelley Matthews, and she didn't pay me to put her in here, but I think with her work a lot. But the feminist rhetorical critical approach forces us to even reassess those assumptions, because the text does not indicate that this enslaved person was ever emancipated. From this vantage point, Paul stripped her of her ability to earn income, which gave her value and potentially protected her from her slave owners. From this perspective, the way on one hand attack slave owners by taking away their ability to make money off of a human that is being trafficked. But at the same time, Acts does not have Paul to regard this enslaved person's humanity. Although Acts, alongside its gospel companion Luke, is often considered as friendlier to women than other New Testament texts, Acts still has a problem with this enslaved girl prophesying. She's the only female to have her prophetic speech chronicled in Acts, and Acts uses her as a foil. And in this way, Acts gets in its own way. Post-colonial approaches to this text, especially ones forwarded by scholars like Musa Duba Shimona, highlight how this enslaved girl is juxtaposed narratologically against Lydia, who appears earlier in the passage and at the end of what we just read. Lydia is a well-to-do homeowner, and she received the movement into her home in Macedonia. And as the Jesus followers have now entered into a new territory, Acts employs the tropes of the stereotypical good and noble woman, juxtaposed up and against this indigenous bad girl. The movement and Acts get in the way of this particular enslavement issue, but it gets in its own way of actually recognizing the full dignity of all people. And it gets in its own way by silencing this enslaved girl, who is silenced not for creating a fabrication, but for telling the truth. Acts does not have gender equity or enslavement figured out, at least not in the way that yields true equity or advocates the abolition of slavery in all its forms. Critical frames help us to see the text clearly and then to critically call it what it is. Tending to the ancient audiences beside the text allows us to reconstruct those who would have been familiar with Apollo's Pythian spirit. They would have seen this exchange between Paul and the enslaved girl as a masculinist standoff between two gods, of which Paul's God was the victor and Apollo was the loser. Perhaps enslaved listeners could have seen how tragic this was for the enslaved girl, or they may have been puzzled by something else. They may have been puzzled about what upset or grieved Paul, because it seemed that what the enslaved girl said was true. Several have attempted to uncover what it was about her prophecy that made Paul so uncomfortable. Some have suggested that it was calling Paul's God Theos Hoopsistos, or Most High. That could seem to be a problem if one is concerned that the enslaved girl conflated Paul's Jewish God with Zeus, for whom Hypsistos was a popular nomenclature. And you can see an image behind you of which captures how this name referring to Zeus as Hypsistos has both literary and material evidence, especially from the sanctuary at Dion in Macedonia. But this evidence could have been confusing to the first readers, because Most High is not only used here, but it's also used elsewhere in Acts, like in Stephen's sermon. It's used in the broader context of Luke Acts, in the Magnificat, when Mary sings to the Most High. Of course, there's evidence for this term across the Hebrew Bible, which takes this as the Greek translation of El Elyon, where we see in passages like Psalm 9. And this term, hypsistos, is used approximately 50 times in the Septuagint as a substitute for the tetragrammaton, or the sacred name of God. From this evidence beside the box and exploring the semantics of the Most High, it's still not clear what the problem is. Perhaps the problem is not with these people connected to the Most High, showing a movement of salvation or healing. Perhaps the issue is that the movement has been mischaracterized as validating enslavement. Here in the box, we can look at the words and their potential meanings and see another option for the stories that they can tell. These men are slaves of the highest God. Could we see here an interpretive possibility that the movement does not want to be associated with enslavement, even in terms of how they relate to the divine? Could we see the offense as less about the exorcism and more about Acts attempting to highlight an important theological perspective? The Most High does not see enslavement compatible with the movement for soteria. And you can look on the back and see that I've left the word soteria untranslated here, a word that often means salvation. And I do that because I think it's important that we slow down, especially when we encounter words that we are too familiar with. I avoid salvation here because it's bogged down, especially in our context, with confessional and doctrinal interpretations. Other options are available: healing, rescue, liberation. From this vantage point, Acts uses the enslaved girl to make a contradictory point. These slaves show the movement of liberation. This is not to suggest that others, especially Paul, don't use the language of enslavement to refer to God. Even later in the passage, Paul invites the jailer to trust in Jesus, the Lord, or Master, which is the same term used to describe the enslaved girls and slavers. But I raise the idea of enslavement as incompatible with the movement of liberation to suggest that we can resolve a complex exegetical question by leaning into ideas that may have not fully blossomed in the text yet. Sometimes those are the best ideas that we can latch on to get into the way of injustice. Now, I understand that this work of having to discern which part of the narrative to grasp onto and which part to criticize feels messy. But that is important for doing critical historical work. A history that only tells of triumph is necessarily false. And a story that is too simple is rarely true. Oh, that was good. Let me say that again. A history that only tells of triumph is necessarily false. And a story that is too simple is rarely true. Again, I know this feels messy, but that's fundamental for how I read Acts, especially in line with this quotation from Maya Kotros's book, Rethinking Christianity. She writes, if Christian historiography at large assumes not only an ancient movement with deep historical import, but one that is given over to empire as or before it reaches full bloom, then maybe it has noticed Acts is not only a story of epic significance or utopian or counterculture impulses, but also a story of arrested possibility, of regrettable coalitions with dominant structures and systems, of size and reflections that it should have been some other way. The movement in Acts, similarly to movements now, has to carve out space in a world that does not share its interest, but it shares the language that is available, language that is necessarily insufficient. The messiness of the movement should lead us to move from simple narratives with good guys and bad guys, but should lead us into nuanced portraits. These nuanced portraits help us to be better, more ethical interpreters. They bring the text into dialogue with contemporary concerns, not as prescriptive texts for authorizing groups and people today, but as a conversation partner with wisdom and warnings because of what it got right and what it didn't. Nuance is key for this. Paul's exercising work for Acts is liberative and limiting. The enslaved girl is not only the enemy of the gospel, but also a human caught up in the dominating logics of colonialism and enslavement. And this passage's context aligns with the U.S. context. and that enslavement has direct connotations to incarceration and state police violence. The enslavers craft charges that would motivate anger from an ancient audience, especially those who remember the significance of Philippi as a veteran colony for the Roman military. They claim that they are not Roman, and they teach what is not lawful for Romans to say or do. These charges are obviously fabricated, and there is an interest convergence between the masters and the sheriffs who want to keep the city in peace. Without a trial, they beat Paul and Silas and throw them into jail. And often we skip to the Dionysian prison break and merely read this story as concluded at the conversion of the jailer. But not only does the story not end there, but even before we get there, reading this text with critical criminology, critical race theory, and minoritized biblical criticism force us to see how a church that gets in the way finds its home amongst the incarcerated. Using Michel Foucault's work in the book Discipline and Punish as a lens for engaging critical criminology studies, we see this quote that talks about how people are criminalized or labeled as delinquents as the way to provide a portrait of a larger society. He defines delinquency as a division of illegality for the illicit circuits of profit and power of the dominant class. This particularly becomes relevant for Acts, and this scene in Acts 16. Although Foucault has a particular project of assessing the rise of French prisons, his analysis is helpful for theoretically considering crime, punishment, and what legitimates states intruding on the lives of individuals. The prison in Philippi is constructed as a sociological phenomenon, and often we read the swift chain of events as an aberration. But if we take this as providing clues for how the Roman Empire administered justice, we'll see what Abraham Smith, a colleague over at SMU, said, that in one virtually breathless sentence, the narrative never focalizes on the actions of Paul and Silas. The fact that the magistrates were in lockstep with the slave owners and the crowd, ostensibly in the name of good order, reveals a structural form of violence. With the rush to ensure public safety, a rash judicial policy decision made no less in the proximate space of the agora, where defendants would normally have been examined, it never opens up an opportunity in Luke's long sentence for the magistrates to register a thought about the status of the witnesses themselves. Roughly 16 actions after the seizure of Paul and Silas, they are already locked up and stripped of clothes and dignity. Thus, mixed with physical harm, a judicial policy decision has also brought them social harm. For Luke, prisons do not fulfill a projected role of justice because they repeatedly are drawn as places of official corruption and violence. Despite Rome's claims about justice, such a neglect or social harm as Paul and Silas experienced as prisoners was a quotidian practice in Rome's web of power. Thus, for Luke, prisons were social spaces intended to deny dignity, restrict mobility, and thus reduce the agency of bodies, end quote. Smith's words help us to see this passage and how it provides us a glimpse into Roman justice. And as we see this portrait of Roman justice and how the idea of these people causing a stir would have violated Romans' notions of order, and how the Roman understanding of a dual penalty process where the elite receive different punishments than the lower class, we can see that there's an abhorrent evil that's happening in this text, and an injustice occurs. But the text does a bit of doublespeak, and is ironic in that the charges are not true. The audience understands that the charges could be true, but not in the way that the enslaving accusers say. Paul and the Messiah movement do not directly challenge Rome, apart from the fact that the way to healing and salvation had already been offered by Caesar Augustus. And the movement here is offering another way. If you look on the back, you don't have to look now, but there's evidence of this from a 9th century BC, a year 9 BCE inscription from the Priene calendar, which commemorated the birth of Caesar and says, the providence which has ordered the whole of our life has ordained the most perfect consummation of human life by giving to it Caesar Augustus, by sending him, as it were, a savior for us and those who come after us. The charges also that are raised against the Jesus movement, they're ironic in that Jewishness and Romanness were not incompatible. In other contexts, the movement had actually been prosecuted because they did not seem Jewish enough. Acts here appeals to ways that Jewish people were portrayed as troublemakers across the Roman Empire. And often it gets in its own way in that portrait. The enslavers claim that Paul and Silas's Jewishness is incompatible with Roman life, but they are both Roman citizens in Acts. Also, they are accused of causing a civic disturbance that was certainly illegal in the Roman Empire, but it was actually the enslavers causing the disturbance. But that would pale in comparison to the seismic disturbance that would occur in the prison at midnight. It's in the prison where they show the way of liberation. And I have more to say, but I'm looking at the time, and I think that this is the moment where we take a break. And so we take this break, and I'll come back with part 2 when we come back. Thank you.
Right on. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Jeremy Williams.
Well, thank you all for coming back. I know that breaks are tricky when you have people gathered because people can move away. Either the first half was enjoyable or you're giving me a second chance. Either way, I'm glad that you're back. And I realized that when we left, I didn't drop the teaser that should get you to want to come back. That I'm gonna start this section off talking about what's illegal to talk about in the state of Texas, critical race theory. So bam, you got a special gift. So if you remember, we were in Acts 16, and we were at the point where we were discussing how the charges were levied against Paul, Silas, and the Messiah movement, and how they hadn't actually violated any laws, but they were targeted because someone valued property over people. And if we pull back to those behind-the-box questions I raised before, we can include CRT, or critical race theory, as a part of the framework. I want you to lean into this because this might be a little new for some of us, but I think that it can be helpful. Particularly, critical race theory's concerns about interest convergence and material determinism. I believe that they really apply to this passage. Defining those really simply, put an economic interest of the enslavers who had lost their golden ticket prophetic enslaved girl, led them to involve those who were invested with authority to maintain law and order for the only purpose, a specific purpose, of targeting a group. They use dog whistle terminology, like they are causing a civic disturbance. They are different outsiders, and they attack our traditional values. When the passage clearly demonstrates that their only actual concern was their financial loss. They leveraged the judicial processes of the Roman colony of Philippi for their own interest, for their own propertied interests. From this vantage point, Acts portrays the movement as criminalized. So what if that is the identity that we lead with in considering the apostles? Criminalized, with frequent run-ins with the law, mistreated by law enforcement, and subjected to courts that were comically inefficient. This is not to denigrate Acts, but it is a way to potentially refocus our engagement with it. It's not to disparage the earliest leaders of the movement, but to demonstrate how contemporary analogs may not only be found in those vested in black robes and white albs, but also those in orange jumpsuits. From this perspective, the church gets in the way by whom it shows solidarity with. When we understand that the earliest Jesus followers were charged on false charges, then perhaps this passage can speak to not just injustice in Philippi and Acts, but everywhere people are criminalized for someone else's profit, or police punish someone to preserve an imagined order while being the ones creating the disorder. What would change if we read Acts less as a triumphal narrative of the irresistible power of the good news, and more as a chronicle of convicts who were sometimes punished as political prisoners and other times were targeted because of their difference and perceived incompatibility with Roman life? Such an examination could lead us to reconsider where we put the accents on the story. Many read this story as concluding with the jailer's conversion after the earthquake. But what if the movement for healing and liberation shines through in other moments in this passage? For example, the resilience or abject joy, as Ryan Schellenberg discusses, which we find in Paul and Silas's praying in an impossible, unjust situation. That could be a place for highlighting the movement for liberation and healing. This response actually aligns with notions from Paul's authentic letters like Philippians, where he rejoices in spite of the horrors of the ancient prison. How could this inspire us to think of humans put in cages who have to struggle to maintain their sense of dignity in the most undignifying of circumstances? Also, at midnight, when the earthquakes, all of a sudden, all the prisoners and all the prisons are open, not just those part of a movement. Could this not register as a divine critique of the carceral system? Similarly to when Jesus was lawfully prosecuted and executed, but God responded by overturning that ruling of the court and raising Jesus from the dead. Acts scripts God's power as manifesting through an earthquake that shakes the very foundations of the Roman military colonial city of Philippi. This demonstration of power can be understood as God's voice mitigated through an earthquake, which is a speech register for God in the Septuagint. The freedom from prison, like the resurrection of Jesus and the exorcism of the enslaved girl, corrects the narrative that had criminalized, exploited, and imprisoned those who would speak the truth. Theologian Willie Jennings notes that the imprisonment of the Messiah movement in Acts 16 must be understood with Jesus' own arrest, conviction, and sentencing. He writes, Jesus was not simply someone who got caught up in the judicial system, but the one who shattered its connection to morality and righteousness, because the righteous child of God was imprisoned. Similarly, Paul and Silas's imprisonment and subsequent release by divine intervention register a theological critique to unjust carceral and judicial practices. Here, God shakes the entire prison and opens all of the gates. Those not a part of the movement are released too. Also, similar to Jesus on the cross, liberation theologians have helped us to see that our observation that Jesus should not have been crucified by unjust, brutal Roman practices not only tells us what God thinks about Jesus, but it also tells us what God thinks about those crucified with him. They should be taken off of their crosses, just like all of the imprisoned people are released from their prisons. James Cone, in The Cross and the Lynching Tree, notes that the real scandal of the gospel is this: humanity's salvation is revealed in the cross of the condemned criminal Jesus, and humanity's salvation is available only through our solidarity with crucified people in our midst. In this way, the movement of liberation is less about the salvation of the jailer, but about the liberation of those imprisoned and the healing of a society. Could Paul's invitation to the jailer to not kill himself, but to join the movement of healing and liberation, be an opportunity for demonstrating how not only the imprisoned, but every person that is complicit with the system, from guards to police to sheriffs to courts to politicians, are all culpable and subject to divine critique? But they still have time to join the movement for liberation. The imprisoned were free, but the jailer was still bound to Roman laws that required his life for the loss of any prisoner. When the jailer accepts Paul's offer and trusts Jesus the Messiah, which leads to the salvation of his oikos or household, we often imagine a family apart from his job. But often people were not imprisoned in antiquity in a jail proper, but in a variety of buildings, including people's homes. What if the prison was in the jailer's home? What if his joining the movement of liberation is linked towards all of the imprisoned who could now be considered as a part of his house? His family has changed and in some ways expanded to include those who were criminalized. Answering these questions could lead us to seeing in Acts and in Philippi a glimpse of a new world with shattered chains and broken prisons. Now, I have to also highlight that these questions are not straightforward and that my reading is not self-evident, because in a lot of ways, as we discussed before, at the same time that Acts gets in the way of injustice, it gets in its own way. Acts does not categorically dismiss the type of mistreatment that the movement members experience. It plays into Roman logics and suggests that Paul and Silas should not have been treated this way, not only because they were innocent, but because they're Roman citizens. It's similar to Greek novels in that the protagonists have been mischaracterized, and that's why they're treated poorly. A more just stance would be that anyone who is treated in such ignoble ways have been mischaracterized as less than a human. Acts uses Roman citizenship, which is probably a fabrication in terms of the historical Paul. But it uses Roman citizenship to show that certain people should not be treated in a certain way, but it does not suggest the larger injustices of the system. Furthermore, at the end of the passage, the imprisoned remain in prison. Only Paul and Silas, with their Roman citizenship, are set free. Although shaken up significantly, the carceral complex in Philippi is still in place. Even after God shakes it up and the movement for liberation disrupts it, it still remains and reminds us that, like the book of Acts, the work of liberation is unfinished. In our time together, we've discussed how the way, or the movement, and you can see a bit of a recap on the back. You can just look at it real quick. If you want to take a picture, you could. I'll leave it up there. So in our time together, as people are taking pictures of that, let me go to, right, you get that, and then the questions. That's smaller, but those are the questions that I raised around ways to think about reading Acts. So, in our time together, I discussed how the way or the movement for liberation and healing is the preferred way for Acts to talk about the earliest Jesus followers. This movement for liberation and healing for Acts portrays the group as getting in the way of injustice and oppressive systems, especially by demonstrating solidarity with the minoritized and criminalized. But also, the movement gets in its own way of breaking free from imperial models and reinscribing violent tropes, especially against Jewish people. What happens when we elevate characters like the enslaved girl or the criminalized or the imprisoned? How do they help us to understand how the Jesus followers could have been read in their first audiences? But also, how do they provide glimpses for us on where the way or the movement has yet to go in the progress for justice, for liberation, for abolition, for healing, for full inclusion of all people, for resisting all forms of oppression? Acts movement is not perfect, nor is ours. Messy origins help us to recognize that identity negotiation is not foreign to Jesus-following communities, but constitutive of them. Even as Acts attempts to paint a unified front, frictions and fissures still persist, which means that the movement can take many directions, and it's up to those who understand it as a movement for liberation and healing to keep pushing it toward new horizons and toward what Ashawn Crawley calls an otherwise world. Part of what my goal has been is to show how the tools of biblical interpretation can help us to do three things: to clearly see what it was, critically call it what it is, and creatively celebrate what can be. Clearly seeing what it was is important. We have to be able to look at the past and do our best to remember. Which reminds me of this important quotation from the Equal Justice Institute in Montgomery, my home state. And there at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, an image there is behind you, and you probably can't read it, but it reads, "For the hanged and beaten, for the shot, drowned, and burned, for the tortured, tormented, and terrorized, for those abandoned by the rule of law, we will remember. With hope, because hopelessness is the enemy of justice. With courage, because peace requires bravery. With persistence, because justice is a constant struggle. With faith, because we shall overcome." Now, we don't really have to go back far to remember. We can just go back 2 weeks to Memphis, Tennessee, to the murder of Tyree Nichols by 5 officers. Clearly seeing what was is important so that we can call it what it is. Because the strange fruit of the prison industrial system and extrajudicial brutality of police officers is linked to the strange fruit hung on southern trees, which must be linked to the strange fruit Roman officers hung on a cross at Golgotha. The strange fruit that Acts Messiah movement recognized as both the criminalized one and the just one. The church that gets in the way has to be able to clearly see what it was and critically call it what it is so that people can see the importance of abolition work today. This work is even more important as U.S. state legislatures are banning the teaching of critical race theory. And just last week, Ron DeSantis in Florida banned the teaching of AP African American history, charting the continuity and disruption between the Roman criminalizing of troublemakers and the American criminalizing of descendants of slaves, immigrants, Muslims, and Palestinians provides fertile ground for interrogating how certain groups are still portrayed as criminals. Militarized police on beats in Roman Philippi, ready to punish those who were considered other, resonates with tanks rolling down the streets to confront Black Lives Matter protesters in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 2020. These connections should lead us to sobriety, but not hopelessness. In the words of William Barber, we are called to be a movement for wholeness in a broken world and to stand for justice. So help us God. The connections should help us to see our world and to use the Bible and Acts to imagine an otherwise world. Then we can truly celebrate what can be a world where the movement for liberation and healing does not get in its own way, but it moves toward the type of justice that eliminates the need for prisons. A world that does not justify inequity. A world that does not tolerate enslavement in any form. Acts had a long way to go to get to that kind of world, and so do we. Thank you.